In the early morning hours of June 10, 2020, Chelsea Whitby found her 18-month-old son, Emerson, unresponsive in his crib. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but despite their best efforts, the toddler was declared dead at the hospital. What should have been a simple tragedy quickly turned into a nightmare. Emerson's death, ruled as blunt force trauma to the head, led to one of the most heartbreaking and complex legal battles. Was it an accident, or did a mother harm her own child in ways that no one could have imagined? In this case, the truth remains tangled, and the question remains, could Chelsea Whitby really be innocent? Or is there more to this heartbreaking story? Emerson Whitby was born on October 25, 2018, to Chelsea Whitby, a single mother who was devoted to her child from the moment he entered the world. Emerson, an energetic 18-month-old, had all the signs of a bright and curious toddler, always exploring, eager to discover new things, and constantly moving. His small hands reached out to touch everything in his path, his eyes filled with wonder at the world around him. Chelsea, despite the challenges of motherhood, was deeply committed to Emerson, pouring all her energy into ensuring he had everything he needed. But life wasn't always easy for Chelsea. A few months before Emerson's tragic death, she had ended a relationship that had left her feeling isolated and vulnerable. The strain of being a single mother, coupled with financial difficulties, was beginning to take its toll. However, those who knew Chelsea, from close friends to family members, never questioned her love for Emerson. She did what she could to make ends meet, juggling work and caring for her son on her own. There was no question that Emerson was her world, even if the weight of everything else seemed to press in on her. Throughout Emerson's early years, there were the typical bumps and bruises that come with a toddler's exploration of the world. He'd had his fair share of scrapes and falls, as most children do when they're learning to walk and play. In fact, a few months before his death, Emerson had visited the doctor a couple of times after minor falls, nothing that seemed to warrant concern at the time. Doctors reassured Chelsea that these were normal injuries for a toddler, nothing to be alarmed about. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. By early spring of 2020, Chelsea had reached out for help, confessing that she was feeling overwhelmed by the weight of her responsibilities. She was struggling to balance the demands of motherhood with the challenges of life outside her home. Though she didn't show it outwardly, Chelsea was becoming more anxious, overwhelmed by the emotional and financial strain she was under. Her friends and family had noticed a change in her. She was a loving, dedicated mother, but the stress of daily life, combined with personal struggles, was starting to wear on her. Still, no one could have predicted what was coming next. No one could have imagined that the small, seemingly innocent injuries Emerson had suffered, falls from climbing on furniture, the typical bruises from being a toddler, would be something far more sinister when combined with the medical findings of June 2020. And yet, these were the pieces that would eventually lead to one of the most heart-wrenching and complicated legal cases in recent memory. On the morning of June 10, 2020, Chelsea Whitby went about her daily routine, like any other mother. She was preparing breakfast for herself and her 18-month-old son, Emerson. It was a quiet day, the kind where everything seemed to be moving smoothly. Emerson, as usual, had spent most of the morning playing in his crib, surrounded by his toys, giggling and laughing as he did every day. But in an instant, everything would change. Chelsea, just finishing up in the kitchen, decided to check on her son. It was a habit she'd developed, a comforting ritual of making sure Emerson was okay before moving on to the next task. As she approached his crib, something felt off. Emerson wasn't sitting up, he wasn't playing, and he wasn't making his usual baby noises. With her heart already sinking, Chelsea leaned over the crib to check on him more closely. Emerson's body was motionless, his little chest didn't rise and fall with the rhythm of breathing. Panic surged through her as she reached down to gently shake him, whispering his name. "Emerson, wake up, baby." But he didn't respond. In sheer terror, Chelsea called out to him again, her voice trembling, the fear setting in. There was no movement, no sign that her son was even alive. Her thoughts raced, but they were overwhelmed by one thing: her baby wasn't breathing. Her world tilted in that moment. This wasn't supposed to happen. Without a moment to lose, Chelsea grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice, shaking and desperate, echoed in the call. "Please, I need help. My son is unresponsive. He's not breathing." On the other end of the line, the operator instructed her to perform CPR, but Chelsea's hands were trembling, and it felt like time was slipping away. Paramedics arrived within minutes. The scene unfolded quickly. Chelsea's frantic cries, Emerson's lifeless body, the rush of emergency responders trying to revive him. It seemed like everything was happening in slow motion. But with urgency, they rushed him to the hospital, desperately trying to save him. The air was thick with anxiety, uncertainty, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Chelsea, clutching on to any hope she had, was in a state of disbelief. Could this really be happening? Her baby, gone so suddenly, so violently. The hospital staff did everything they could, but by the time they arrived, it was clear. Emerson Whitby was gone. At only 18 months old, he had lost his life. Chelsea was shattered. How could this happen? How could her little boy be gone? The doctors confirmed the devastating news. Emerson was dead. The morning after Emerson's tragic death, the authorities were quick to begin their investigation, focusing immediately on the cause of the boy's death. An autopsy was conducted, and the results were chilling. The medical examiner confirmed that Emerson had died from blunt force trauma to the head, causing a fatal subdural hemorrhage. This type of injury is typically seen in cases of physical abuse or extreme violence, not in accidents. The brutal truth began to unfold. The tiny boy had sustained injuries far beyond what would be expected from a fall or even rough play. As the investigation continued, medical experts delved deeper into Emerson's injuries. Pathologists noted that the blunt force trauma was not a single event, but appeared to have been inflicted with force, and in a manner that suggested it wasn't just an isolated incident. There were signs of older injuries, specifically a bruise on Emerson's forehead, that appeared to be several weeks old. This raised even more questions. Was it possible that Emerson had been subjected to ongoing harm, or was this a tragic accident that escalated in a moment of misfortune? But the medical team didn't stop there. They explored every angle, examining not only the physical wounds but also Emerson's medical history. They discovered that Emerson had been a healthy, active toddler before his death, which made the severity of his injuries even more perplexing. Could a small, active child have suffered such a fatal injury in the blink of an eye? Medical experts suggested that the nature of the injury seemed more consistent with forceful blows, possibly inflicted during a time of emotional distress or frustration. The more they examined the details, the clearer it became the trauma to Emerson's head was catastrophic, and something far more violent than a simple fall had occurred. But there was a twist. Some medical experts argued that Emerson might have been more vulnerable to head injury than initially thought. They pointed to his prior injury, the small bruise on his forehead that had been overlooked at first, suggesting that Emerson might have suffered from a previous trauma that made his brain more susceptible to damage. This theory opened up an entirely new line of questioning. Could Emerson have had an underlying medical condition, perhaps a blood clotting disorder, that caused his brain to be more fragile? Could this have led to a rebleed of an earlier injury, causing the fatal outcome? The conflicting opinions between the medical experts made the situation even more complex. Some argued that the trauma was deliberate and couldn't have been accidental, while others suggested that the injury was the result of a tragic set of circumstances, a fall or an accidental blow that had catastrophic consequences. The medical evidence, though damning in its own way, left room for interpretation. Was Emerson's death a case of abuse, or was it an unavoidable tragedy? As the medical findings continued to be debated, they only served to deepen the mystery and intensify the pressure on the legal teams involved. For Chelsea Whitby, the mother, these medical findings were both a curse and a blessing. On one hand, they painted a picture of a horrific injury that led to her son's death. On the other, they offered an explanation, though still troubling, that there could have been something more to Emerson's condition that contributed to his tragic fate. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that the medical findings weren't just important in determining how Emerson died, they were also pivotal in determining whether Chelsea would stand trial for her son's death. With the autopsy results and the mounting medical evidence pointing in different directions, the case grew more complicated by the day. The medical professionals continued to disagree on the nature of the injury, making it even harder to pin down exactly what had happened in that quiet home on June 10, 2020. Chelsea's story remained consistent, that Emerson had been her healthy, playful child until that fateful morning. But with every new detail from the medical examination, the possibility of an accidental death seemed further away, and the suspicion of foul play loomed larger. What was meant to be a straightforward investigation into a child's tragic death had turned into a web of uncertainty, with medical professionals on both sides arguing that they held the key to the truth. The more they uncovered, the more questions emerged. Could one small, seemingly innocent fall really have led to such a deadly injury, or was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered? Chelsea's account was consistent. She claimed she had put Emerson to bed the night before, and when she checked on him the next morning she found him unresponsive in his crib. She didn't understand what had happened. She tried to resuscitate him, but it was too late. There was nothing more she could do. Her story didn't change through repeated interviews, and each time she seemed more devastated by the death of her son. To her it was an accident, a tragic accident, and the grief was overwhelming. She denied any involvement in causing his injuries, and maintained that she was a loving mother. Still, the investigators couldn't ignore the severity of the situation. How could such a young child in the care of his mother sustain injuries like this? The detectives began digging into Chelsea's history, hoping to uncover something that could explain how Emerson had died. They found that there were no reports of prior abuse, no history of violence, and no signs that Chelsea had ever been a troubled individual. On the surface, everything seemed to point to an accident, but the nature of the injuries was still problematic. Could this have truly been just a terrible unintentional event, or was there something deeper, something darker that no one had seen? The investigation continued to focus on Chelsea as the only person who could provide answers. Over the next few weeks, as the case evolved, Chelsea was subjected to multiple rounds of questioning. But it wasn't until the police decided to interrogate her for an extended period that things started to take a different turn. On the day of the 7.5-hour interrogation, Chelsea was under intense pressure. The officers used every trick in the book: sharp questioning, subtle manipulations, and the promise of leniency to try to get her to admit to anything that would explain Emerson's death. Throughout the entire ordeal, Chelsea remained steadfast in her innocence. She never wavered, never cracked under the pressure. Every time she was asked whether she had harmed her son, whether she had caused his injuries, her response was the same: no. Chelsea's refusal to confess puzzled the detectives. Could she really be telling the truth? Or was she simply a mother trying to cover up something far more horrific? As they continued to dig deeper, investigators found that there had been earlier signs of injury to Emerson. In the weeks leading up to his death, Emerson had suffered minor bumps and bruises. Chelsea explained these injuries as the result of normal toddler behavior, falls and tumbles that could happen to any young child. It was something that many parents experienced with their children, as they learned to walk and navigate their world. But what was unsettling to the detectives was that some of these injuries seemed more serious than what might be expected from ordinary toddler accidents. Could they have been linked to something more serious? Chelsea's explanation for the injuries didn't satisfy the investigators. They began to suspect that the bruises and marks on Emerson's body could have been signs of something more sinister, something that had been happening gradually over time. But without clear evidence of abuse or neglect, the investigation was in a state of limbo. How could they prove anything beyond doubt? Were these injuries indicative of a pattern of abuse, or were they just unfortunate accidents that occurred while Emerson was learning to walk? As the investigation continued, the police were faced with a growing sense of uncertainty. They needed more than just circumstantial evidence. They needed something concrete, something irrefutable that would definitively connect Chelsea to Emerson's injuries. Forensic experts were brought in to examine the injuries more closely. Some experts suggested that the trauma Emerson sustained could have been the result of a fall, but others pointed to the sheer force of the injury and questioned whether a simple tumble could have caused such damage. The opinions of the experts were divided, and that only made the case more complicated. The more they looked, the more questions arose, and still, there was no clear-cut answer. As the police continued their investigation, the case became more tangled. They questioned neighbors, friends, and family members, trying to find out if there had been any signs of distress or unusual behavior leading up to Emerson's death. Everyone described Chelsea as a loving mother, deeply devoted to her son. There were no signs of anger or hostility in the home, no reports of violence or tension between Chelsea and Emerson. But something wasn't adding up. If Chelsea was innocent, why had Emerson sustained such severe injuries? The investigation eventually led to the realization that, while they had a lot of circumstantial evidence, there wasn't enough to definitively prove that Chelsea was responsible for her son's death. No one could say for certain whether the injuries were caused by a single traumatic event or by a series of incidents that had gradually worsened over time. Without a confession or clear evidence, the case remained a mystery. The detectives had their suspicions, but they couldn't build a case strong enough to charge Chelsea with a crime. And so, the investigation into Emerson Whitby's death continued to hang in the balance. As more time passed, the question remained, was this a tragic accident, a mother's worst nightmare, or was there a darker, more complex truth waiting to be uncovered? The evidence seemed to suggest something was terribly wrong, but the police had no answers, and Chelsea's story remained unchanged. As the courtroom doors closed behind Chelsea Whitby, the atmosphere shifted. The echo of footsteps on the tile floor was replaced by murmurs of anticipation. In front of her, a panel of jurors prepared to dissect her life, her choices, and ultimately, the question no mother should ever face: did she kill her child? The charge was second-degree murder, a crime defined by intent without premeditation. Prosecutors contended that Chelsea, overwhelmed and possibly resentful, had lost control, and that Emerson, just 18 months old, had paid the price. Chelsea, pale and visibly exhausted, sat silently as the proceedings began. Her face bore the weight of both grief and accusation. The Crown's opening statement was sharp, deliberate, and emotionally charged. They alleged that the injuries sustained by Emerson weren't sudden or isolated. They were cumulative, a pattern of escalating harm over time. The prosecution claimed Chelsea was the only adult present during the crucial window, and that no other explanation could account for the severity of Emerson's head trauma. They presented the medical evidence like puzzle pieces, each intended to build toward a single conclusion. According to the autopsy, Emerson died from blunt force trauma to the head, leading to a catastrophic subdural hemorrhage. One of the pathologists, seasoned in pediatric forensics, took the stand and testified that the force required to cause such damage was severe and unlikely to result from normal childhood accidents. The courtroom listened closely as images of Emerson's injuries were shown. Carefully, respectfully, but unavoidably, some jurors turned away. Others took notes, their pens moving in a measured rhythm. The prosecution leaned heavily on these visuals, using them to underscore the alleged brutality of the act. They argued that Chelsea's behavior during the investigation also raised red flags: subtle inconsistencies in her timeline, moments of vagueness during her police interviews, and a perceived emotional detachment. And then came the interrogation. A 7.5-hour video, played in segments over 2 days. In it, Chelsea sat across from 2 veteran detectives. Her posture was rigid, her voice quivering at times. Throughout the grueling session, she repeatedly denied harming her son. "I didn't do anything to Emerson," she whispered at one point. The officers used a range of tactics, from empathetic tones to confrontational pressure, but Chelsea's narrative never wavered. For the prosecution, her resistance was interpreted as rehearsed. For the defense, it was unshakable proof of her innocence. When the defense took over, the energy in the room shifted again. Chelsea's attorney, Darren Crouchar, approached the case with a methodical calm, deliberately dismantling the prosecution's theory piece by piece. His strategy wasn't to introduce a new villain, but to introduce doubt, a shadow of uncertainty that could disrupt the chain the Crown had carefully constructed. He began with the timeline. Emerson had shown signs of minor injuries weeks before his death: bruises, head bumps, even a brief visit to a walk-in clinic. Crouchar suggested these incidents, though dismissed at the time, could have indicated an earlier undetected trauma. He called a neurology expert to testify that a previous head injury, even minor, could create a re-bleed scenario, one where blood pools slowly in the skull and later ruptures without warning. Then came the cross-examination of the pathologist. Crouchar questioned the certainty of the findings. Were they absolutely indicative of abuse, or could a single fall down the stairs, like the one Chelsea mentioned in her statement, be enough to explain them? The expert hesitated. It's uncommon, they admitted, but not impossible. The defense also highlighted Chelsea's cooperation. She never fled. She answered every police question. She handed over her phone, her home, her life for investigation. Is that the behavior of someone with something to hide? Crouchar asked the jury, pausing for emphasis. What made the defense's case so powerful wasn't just the doubt it sowed, it was the emotional clarity they offered. Friends and family testified to Chelsea's love for her son. Photos were shown of Chelsea and Emerson at the park, at home, laughing together. Text messages from Chelsea to her friends spoke of sleepless nights and doctor visits, of concern and affection. She had no criminal history, no known history of violence, no motive. Still, the prosecution pushed back hard. They called additional medical experts to reassert that the likelihood of a rebleed scenario was extremely rare, especially in a child so young. They emphasized the lack of external factors: no stairs, no witnesses to a fall, no neighbors reporting a loud crash. The damage they claimed was internal, and the cause was deliberate. Day by day, the courtroom became a pressure cooker of conflicting truths. Jurors watched hours of testimony. They saw Chelsea break down when her son's autopsy report was read aloud. They listened to forensic experts argue over millimeters of bleeding in the brain. They studied a timeline so precise it tracked diaper changes and bottle feedings. By the time both sides rested, one thing was clear: the case was not straightforward. There was no confession, no smoking gun, only two narratives, each plausible, each anchored in grief, and each demanding a different outcome. In closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to connect the dots. A child doesn't die like this without cause, the Crown stated. The cause was in this courtroom every day. You've seen her, you've heard her. They asked for justice, not just for Emerson, but for the safety of all children. The defense, in contrast, focused on the standard of proof. This isn't about sympathy, Crouchar said. This is about certainty. And if you are not certain, if even a sliver of doubt remains, you must find her not guilty. And with that, the fate of Chelsea Whitby rested with 12 strangers. The courtroom was silent as the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. No one could predict how long it would take, or what their verdict would be, but one truth remained: a child was gone, a mother was on trial, and a family was forever changed. After weeks of intense courtroom drama, Chelsea Whitby's trial had come to its final moments. The tension was palpable as the jury deliberated, knowing that the fate of a mother accused of her child's death hung in the balance. The details of Emerson Whitby's tragic death had been carefully examined: his injuries, the circumstances, the medical testimony, and the courtroom was filled with the heavy weight of conflicting emotions. The prosecution had presented a case suggesting that Emerson's injuries weren't an accident, but the result of blunt force trauma inflicted intentionally. They pointed to the fact that Chelsea, the only adult present during the critical time, had left unexplained injuries on Emerson's fragile body. A broken skull, a bleeding brain, were they the result of a tragic misstep or a deliberate act? The prosecution painted a picture of a mother who had failed to care for her child, a mother who may have let anger or frustration manifest in a way that ultimately led to the toddler's untimely death. On the other hand, the defense worked tirelessly to cast doubt on the accusations. They argued that there was simply no direct proof that Chelsea had caused Emerson's injuries, suggesting instead that Emerson might have suffered from a previous injury that led to a fatal rebleed, a theory that doctors and medical experts could not rule out. They pushed the idea that the medical evidence didn't point definitively to abuse, but to a tragic yet plausible accident. In the end, they asked the court to consider the possibility that Chelsea, overwhelmed and grieving, could not possibly be the cause of her child's death. Then, on a cold, quiet morning, the long-awaited verdict was delivered. Chelsea sat with her defense team in the courtroom, her eyes locked forward, every muscle tense as she waited for Justice Catherine Dawson to speak. The silence in the room was deafening. The audience held their collective breath as the judge made her way through the complexities of the case. When Justice Dawson finally read the verdict, the room was silent for a moment. The words echoed through the courtroom, and Chelsea's family, who had sat through weeks of emotionally charged testimony, quietly exhaled. Chelsea Whitby was found not guilty of second-degree murder and manslaughter. There was no doubt about the tragedy of Emerson's death, but there was simply not enough proof to convict Chelsea beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge acknowledged the pain of the situation, but in the eyes of the law, the evidence did not meet the necessary threshold for a conviction. Chelsea sat still as the words sank in. It was a moment of release, but also of grief that had been building since the morning Emerson was found unresponsive in his crib. The trial had put her through a relentless public ordeal, and now as she heard the verdict, there was no joy, only the unbearable knowledge that she would never be able to undo the tragedy of losing her son. Her supporters, her family and friends who had stood by her throughout the trial, finally allowed themselves a breath of relief. The fear of a life sentence had loomed over them for months, and now it was over. Chelsea had been cleared of all charges, and while the relief was overwhelming, it was also tainted by the heavy burden of what had already transpired. However, across the courtroom, the atmosphere was markedly different. Emerson's extended family, who had spent every day since the tragedy fighting for justice, were visibly shaken. The not guilty verdict struck them like a heavy blow, a cruel reminder that the person they believed responsible for Emerson's death would walk free. To them, the legal system had failed. They had fought for justice for Emerson, but in their eyes, the truth remained lost. Some family members struggled to keep their composure, and a few even left the courtroom in tears. The weight of Emerson's death was now compounded by the sense that justice had not been served. The heartbreak of losing a loved one was already unbearable, but now they were forced to accept that the one they suspected of causing his death would not face any legal consequence. For them, this wasn't just the loss of a child, it was the loss of the chance to have the truth come to light. Following the verdict, Chelsea gave a statement to the media. Standing outside the courthouse with reporters gathered around her, she spoke softly but firmly, her voice trembling as she addressed the public for the first time since the trial began. She thanked her family, friends, and legal team for their support, but the sorrow in her eyes was undeniable. "I didn't do this," she said, her words carrying the weight of both the relief of acquittal and the sorrow of what had happened. "But my heart will never heal from what happened to Emerson." Despite Chelsea's words, the public remained divided. To some, she was simply a mother who had been unjustly accused, but to others, her acquittal was a heartbreaking miscarriage of justice. The loss of Emerson was undeniably tragic, but the lingering question of how he died still haunted everyone involved. The details of his injuries, the way they appeared to be inflicted, left many wondering if they would ever know the true story behind his death. The prosecution also expressed disappointment with the verdict. Prosecutor Adam Brecker addressed the press, acknowledging the emotional toll the case had taken on everyone involved, including the family of Emerson Whitby. "We did our best to bring this case to court, but it's a reminder of how challenging it can be to prove cases where the evidence is circumstantial and the facts are unclear," he said. "This is a tragic case that will stick with everyone who followed it." He was visibly upset, his frustration evident as he spoke about the difficulty in securing a conviction when the truth seemed so elusive. For the defense, the victory was a bittersweet one. Chelsea's lawyer, Darren Crouchar, spoke on behalf of his client, acknowledging the difficulty of the case and the complexity of the emotions involved. "This verdict doesn't change the fact that a mother lost her son," he said. "It's been a long, hard road, but today Chelsea is able to move on, though the pain she feels will never go away." As Chelsea walked free, the reactions of the public were a mix of disbelief, anger, and confusion. Social media exploded with opinions, some supporting Chelsea and others questioning the verdict. Was she guilty, or was she just a mother caught in a tragic and unexplainable situation? The case sparked debates about justice, the reliability of circumstantial evidence, and whether a mother could ever truly escape the guilt of losing a child in such a tragic manner. After Chelsea Whitby was acquitted of all charges in September 2023, the case didn't fade quietly into the background. The public reaction was mixed. While some believed the justice system had done its job, others were left with lingering doubts about the true cause of Emerson's death. Chelsea's acquittal sparked debates across social media, with many questioning the verdict and the complexity of the evidence. For some, the uncertainty surrounding the case would never be fully resolved. For Chelsea, the aftermath was just as complicated. Despite the legal victory, she was far from being able to return to her normal life. The emotional toll of the trial was undeniable. Her family, who had stood by her throughout the legal battle, now had to grapple with their own healing process. Chelsea stayed largely out of the public eye after the trial, though she did make a brief statement expressing relief at the acquittal but emphasizing the pain she still carried from losing her son. In the months following, there were no major public interviews, and Chelsea's social media accounts remained mostly silent. But some speculated that the media's intense focus on her life would eventually lead to a breaking point. The case, no matter how it was concluded, would forever be a shadow over her. In the legal world, the case continued to be cited as an example of how difficult it can be to prove guilt in cases of suspected child harm, especially when the evidence is circumstantial. Prosecutors expressed frustration at not being able to deliver a clear conviction, while defense attorneys pointed to the critical importance of protecting a defendant's right to a fair trial. For the public, the case lingered. Discussions about the true nature of Emerson's injuries continued to swirl in online forums, with many still divided over what happened in those final hours of Emerson's life. Was Chelsea really innocent, or had the trial failed to uncover a deeper truth? Despite the acquittal, the mystery surrounding Emerson Whitby's death remained unresolved in the eyes of many, keeping his tragic story alive in the minds of those who followed every detail of the case. In the end, the loss of Emerson Whitby remained a deep wound for those who loved him, and for the public, the case served as a haunting reminder of the complexity of justice. Was Chelsea guilty of taking her son's life? Or was this an unimaginable accident that no one could foresee? The court had ruled, but the emotional scars of this case would linger long after the verdict was announced. As Chelsea's story unfolded in the court of public opinion, one thing remained certain: the pain of losing Emerson would never fully fade. For her, for his family, or for a community left to wonder if they would ever truly know the full story behind his death. With Chelsea Whitby's acquittal, the case left more questions than answers. The trial had exposed the intricacies of the justice system, highlighting the difficulty of securing a conviction in cases where the evidence is circumstantial. The prosecution struggled to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Chelsea had intentionally caused harm to Emerson, while the defense successfully presented the possibility of an accidental injury that escalated into a tragic outcome. This is a reminder of how the legal system operates on the principle of innocent until proven guilty, but it also raises uncomfortable truths about what can and cannot be conclusively proven in court. For the prosecution, the case was not about proving that Chelsea was unquestionably guilty, but about presenting a timeline of events that suggested she was responsible for her son's injuries. They relied on expert testimony about the nature of the wounds, but without direct evidence, their case fell apart in the face of reasonable doubt. On the other hand, the defense's argument didn't rely on convincing the jury that Chelsea was innocent. Rather, they cast enough doubt on the prosecution's theory to avoid a conviction. Ethically, the case posed a difficult dilemma for those involved, whether in law enforcement, the courts, or the general public. How do we balance the need for justice for a young child with the recognition that a mother may be wrongly accused? The emotional toll on all parties involved is immense. While the truth of what happened in that home may never be fully known, the case serves as a stark reminder of the weight of justice and the challenge of uncovering the truth when there is no clear answer. In the aftermath of the trial, Chelsea's life was forever altered. Public opinion remains divided, with some believing she was wrongly acquitted, while others feel the system failed to hold her accountable. But in the end, the case leaves us grappling with a painful reality. Sometimes, in the pursuit of justice, the truth is just out of reach. Was justice served, or was a grieving mother allowed to walk free despite the uncertainty surrounding her son's death? While some still believe Chelsea's innocence, others remain unconvinced, questioning what truly happened behind the closed doors of that quiet home. In the end, the case of Emerson Whitby leaves us with more questions than answers. What happened to him in those final moments? And why did his death remain shrouded in so much doubt? As we reflect on this heartbreaking story, we are reminded of the fragile line between tragedy and justice, and the lives that are forever altered when the truth becomes elusive. If you have your own thoughts on what happened in this case, we'd love to hear from you. Leave your comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime stories that leave us questioning the things we thought we knew.